Okay, so great to be back in Christian's user group. It's an honor. I think my last session was
It's not
2
mine.
years ago.
It's ours.
No.
Exactly.
So great to be back. And yeah, like Christian said, this past week we were in Seattle. We were roomies, and one evening we started talking, and this is the result of that talk. So glad to be presenting, and I saw there's people even from Greece in the chat, so very honored. And let's get things started. So these are the 3 things everyone should know about Power Query, and let me tell you, it's so hard to pick only 3. And like Christian said when we were doing a pre-intro, he said the first one should probably be that people should know that it exists and that it's there.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm guessing everyone has different 3 things, but these are mine. These are 3 things that I notice in my trainings. They're going to go from probably like the simplest to probably like the hardest. But I think these are 3 things that really do make an impact, and people should really be aware when they start using Power Query, because they're like little caveats that can really help you if you start using them. So just a couple of words about me. Christian already said it all. So let me just add this little thing, because it seems like I need to lately. So my name is Gašper Kamenšek. I'm an Excel MVP from Slovenia, which is the only country in the world that has the word love in the name. There you go. Now you learned something. And I see in the chat that there's also someone here from India, so hello. Okay. Now you're all gonna come. This is just a bit of fluff. Okay, now these are the 3 things we're going to be talking about. So the first one is kind of a concept I developed just to easier to understand how Power Query kind of works, because there are some differences as to how it works from a perspective of how you're used to working in Excel. Right, there's some differences in Power Query, and there are some great things that you can do if you start thinking about Power Query steps and queries as variables. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look some examples that are going to portray how that can be very useful. The second one is kind of the one that gets you. It's just a simple fact, a simple limitation to the Power Query editor. And it's the same in Excel as it is in Power BI. And it's a preview of only 1,000 rows. Now, the reason this one gets you is because sometimes there's things that Power Query doesn't see because it's only looking at the top 1,000 rows. And then all of a sudden you do a filter or something, and one of those problems come into 1,000 rows, and then your query just errors out. But you need to be aware, and we're going to show that, right? You need to be aware that this 1,000 row limitation is always there. Well, it's not a limitation. You can always turn it off or switch the entire data set, but you should always be aware of it, because when you do, particularly when you do troubleshooting, when you're trying to find errors, this one can be one of those key things you need to think about first. Okay, and the last one, as I said, the last one is probably very complicated. It's kind of what happens in the background when you execute a query towards certain sources. And it's one of the most important things you need to know if you ever plan on doing big Power Query projects, or even Power BI projects, perhaps even more Power BI, but also just Power Query in Excel. And it's called query folding, and it's something you need to be aware that exists. You need to know what it means, and you need to know how you see it, and then also how, how you can influence it, how to get it to work better, right? It's a performance thing, and you really need to be aware of it. Okay, these are the 3 things, and from here on out, it's a demo. We're going to return to slides later on, but from here on out, it will just be a demo. So let me just find this one. Okay, so we're going to start in Excel, and we're going to start with the first one. Now, the first one just says you should think of Power Query steps and queries as variables. Now, let me present what I mean with that. And to do that, I'm just going to connect to a single file. It will be a TXT file. Let me show you what it looks like. It's this file, right? Nothing special, nothing fancy. It's just one of those regular exports, which next to the data that it has, also has some things that we need or don't need, right? And as long as we don't need them, it's not as, it's not a disaster. But if we do need them, then how can I get this somehow into this? Right? Because obviously I'm not going to keep this 3 rows. I need my data. I need it in a tabular form, so it needs column headers, it needs columns. But if I want to retain this, how do I do that? Right? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to connect to this data. So from file, from TXT, and let's go on a journey. Should be this. There it is. Okay, since it's a TXT data, you need to just give it some info so that it knows how this behaves, what coding it's in, right? So that it recognizes the funny little things that only a couple of nations use, like the funny little symbols, right? It needs to be in a correct coding. Usually it will be UTF-8, but it doesn't matter. These 3 don't matter as much. What matters is, how do we get this piece of data in here, right? And let me go transform, right? So we go into Power Query Editor. This is where the magic happens. Right? Okay, and now here's how you should be thinking about this. Now, obviously, the first thing that happened, it did a change type on me before the data is even introduced in a way, so I'm just going to remove that one. Sometimes Power Query does automatic steps. You should always think if you need them. And now I'm just going to go like this. So I got my source, which is this, right? I'm just going to do a duplicate of this step just so I can rename it. I'll just do fx, so create a new step, which will just be equals the previous step. And I'm going to rename this one, and I'm going to call it base. Right? The reason I'm calling it base is so I can return to base, to home base anytime I want, right? And now I'll basically go after this. So this is a person that has reported, right? And I have been ordered that I need to keep this piece of information. So even though this table only resides in here, and usually I would just go remove top rows, remove top 3, right? If I do that, I lose this piece of information. So before I do that, I somehow need to retain it, right? So let me do this. I'm going to go into the first column. And right now, I don't care about the rest of the data. Right now, I'm just after this one. So what I'm going to say is, I just need to keep whatever is after the colon, right? You see there's a reported by colon, and then you got the name, right? So I just need to keep whatever is after colon. So I'm going to go transform this one. I want you to extract, and I want you to extract text after the limiter. You could also split by, you could do many things, but I'm just going to do text after the limiter. It's not behaving well. let me see if I can get that to work again. No, so let me take this to another screen. It does that sometimes. Okay, this one is not, so let me then split by the limiter. That one is also not behaving well. Well, that's interesting.
Demo
Now I
goes.
can't. Yeah, now I can't even kill it. That's even more interesting. Okay, we go to plan B, which is another Power Query that doesn't have the same limitations that the one in Excel has. So let's go here and let's just pick the same piece of data. So let's go text CSV. We go here, we go to this one. Okay, let me try to close this one again. Just do this. Okay. And now I return to this guy. Well, the demo guys are really not with me. So I need this one. Okay. So basically what I did before was this. I did a copy of the first step and I renamed that base, just so I have it as a reference. There's another reason why you usually should rename your steps, and that is most of the steps that come straight out of the user interface will have spaces in them, and steps that have spaces are very hard to call upon or to reference. Those that don't have spaces are way easier to reference. So names without spaces are usually the way to go. And what you should also do is just go right-click properties and just say, this is a reference step. Or in other words, it's very good if you add sort of comments to your base code, right? Or to base step, which in the end is exactly what I said, a comment. It's a good thing to have that just so you can reference it. And now that we have this, let me go again and just do, well, let me turn column profile off so it doesn't interfere. Okay, and now we're going to go transform, extract, text after delimiter, and the delimiter is a simple colon, like this, right? And now I got what I need, right? It gave me the value I need. Now I need to extract it. And the way I extract it, right-click, drill down. There are multiple ways to do this. I'm going to use this one. So just drill down into this piece of info. And now it sort of created a new step. It said column 1. Why did it say column 1? Well, because that was in a column called column 1. And I just drilled down into that column. I will much rather into a cell of that column, not the entire column. If you drill into a column, you will create a list. But if you drill into a cell, you get a value. And I will rename this. I will call this reporter. So the person who was reporting, right? And at this point, what do I have? Well, I have a query, which over here had a plethora of data, and I shrunk it down in 2 steps to nothing, right? All I have is this name. But here's a great thing about, so if I was in Excel and I deleted everything, it's deleted. But in Power Query, I still have this step called base. So when I'm here, I can go, now give me a fresh new step, and let's start with something called base again, right? And what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, we did that, and we saved it. We have this saved as a reporter. Now let's go back to base. And now let me keep this very simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the top rows, right? The 3 that we don't need. So remove top rows, 3. I'm going to use this first row as header, like this. Now, it destroyed my dates, so I'm going to fix that. So let me just turn this into a date. And the rest of it did fine. So this is time. These are all text. So everything is fine. But now how do I get this piece of information, which again, now I've lost, right? Because I removed the 3 steps, just came down to this. How do I get it back? Well, it's simple. I just add a column, a custom column. Now, I would call it a reporter, but just for demo's sake, let's call it reporter's, reporter's name, right? And what is this equal to? Whatever I call a reporter, right? And what is a reporter? Well, it's the name of this step. And I go, okay. And there it is, right? So what did I do? Well, 2 times during this query, I was actually referencing a state, or I would call it a variable that I saved before. So this is my first variable. It's an entire table. And this is my second variable. It's just one piece of info that I then later can call upon and use, right? Now, another thing where even in this example that would be really useful, and you would use kind of the same trick. What I did here is I removed the top rows, and I removed the top rows how? Well, I removed them just by saying remove top 3. But sometimes you don't know how many top rows you're going to have, right? And in that case, you could do something like this. You could add a column, let's say an index column from, I'm just going to go from 0. You will see why. And let's move that straight to the beginning. Okay. And now I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to say, I don't care how many rows are up there. I just need to know which row is my header row. So I'm going to go to column 1 and I'm going to filter it to ID, right? And now that I have this, what's the piece of info I need? It's actually this one. It's the index of that column. So let me right click, let me drill down. And now I have the index saved up. Now, why does it call it index? That's the name of the column, right? I could rename it if I wanted to, but index seems fine as a name here. And now I can go, okay, now give me base again, right? Now give me base. There you go. And now I go remove top rows. How many? I'll just go 9. And then I'll take this code, this step code, and instead of 9, I'll go just use the index, right? Use the number you got saved up here. And because we started with 0, it didn't remove the header row. It just removed everything before. But again, how did I save that piece of info? Well, I saved it as a step, as a reference step, as a variable, right? Okay, so hopefully this shows you what the idea is of having steps as variables. Let me just try one more. So here I have 2 tables. These 2 tables are just what I usually use as a reference for showing the merges in Power Query, so the joins. They're the left table and the right table. And I use, over here, I call them the system and the check, right? So I have 2 queries. The first one queries this table. That one comes from a system. And then the second one comes from our little checks that we do in Excel. And every time you get an export from the system and some sort of, let's call it personal magic in Excel, what you want to do is you want to compare the 2, right? And when you compare the 2, you may realize there are some differences. Now here, they're artificially made. So the differences are as follows. We have some duplicates here, which is never a good thing and should never be in a system, but we have them. So we will check for that. And we also have some IDs that are missing or they're different. So the 9 is not missing here, but it does contain a different name, whereas here 11 is actually missing, right? So usually when you get these two, when you get the first, let's call it the system export, and you get your personal magic on the right, you want to compare them, and usually you want to compare them in the same way. And as I said, you want to compare how many duplicates do we have, how many everything do we have. And wouldn't it be nice if I just got some sort of a report from Power Query? It does all the merges and it says, well, you have this many duplicates, you have this many of that, and so on. And what I did here is I actually created this. So I went into Power Query. Let me just bring it back so you'll be able to see it. There you go. So I went into Power Query, created two queries, so the system and the check. And now I'll go for the first one. So I'll say, okay, I got the system here and I got the check here. And now let me just check if there are any duplicates in the system. So if there are any IDs that are duplicates, and basically I'll just do this. I'll create a new reference to the system. So just take whatever the system query produces. I'll call it duplicates. There you go. And what I'll do is I'll just do a simple transform group by. So I'll group by the ID and I'll count rows. That's all I'm going to do. And I don't really care about those that are 1. So I'll just say it needs to be greater than 1 because those are my duplicates, right? And now I don't even care which one they are. I could. I don't. I just want to count them. So what I'll do is I'll transform. I'll do some statistics and I'll just count the values. So how many IDs did I get back, right? And this says you have 1 duplicate. Okay. Now I could do one more. Let's just do one more. Let's say I want to check how many IDs I have in my original system table that I don't have in my second table, right? And I will do that with a simple merge queries as new. Here's my system. Here is my check. I'm just going to go by ID, although I hope you remember before that there was a ID 9, which the ID itself did exist in both, but they were actually different. So if I wanted that, I would go by multiple columns and I would get that. But I'm just going to go like this. So I'm going to say, just give me IDs, but give me left outer or left anti, sorry. A left anti-join simply means give me everything that's in the system table, but is not in my check, right? So I go, okay. And this is what I get, right? So the only ID that is missing is ID 11. And again, I could say I'm going to call this missing in system. So that was the name of the query. And I'm going to do a simple statistic of how many is that. So duplicates, missing in system. Now what? Now I have 2 queries with numbers. How do I create my report, right? Well, and I have something prepared here. So let me just create a new blank query. This, and let me go equals excel.current workbook. Love it when it does that. There you go. And the table is, I guess it has a funny name called table 3. So let me drill into that. Right, this is sort of what I prepared as a report. I have my measurement and the result. Right, and obviously my first measurement is how many duplicates I have, and the result should be 1. But whereas before we were doing, let's recall something that was just a step. Now I actually want to say, let's bring something in that is just here somewhere, right? So let's see, how do we do that? My mouse just disappeared, which is funny. Let's see. Oh, okay, I see it back. Let me do this. It will be way easier. And let me change. I'm going to try and do something, although I don't necessarily think it's going to be the best thing ever, but we'll see. Okay. So it didn't change anything. So, okay. I have my query, and now I just want to say add to the measurement column, add the text duplicates, and to the result column, just add the whatever the duplicates query gives you, right? And how do I do that? Well, it's a blank new step. And what it needs to do is table dot add rows. Oh, this is just so small. Let me try and make this bigger. Let me take this offline. Yeah, it's still not bigger. The graphics is just...
You could try Control Shift Plus.
No, I know that one, but that one I don't like because then I don't find the... So let me just try with this. Okay, basically, let me show you what I'm trying to do, and then I'll just leave it at that. So what I'm trying to do is add a record, right? If you try to add it as rows, it's always a list of records, which would somehow look like this, right? But basically, I would do this. Measurements. So measurement column equals duplicates, because it's just a string. But here comes the magic. Then I have the result column, right? And the result column would equal my duplicates. And the magic here is what this record is. Let me show you, right? Measurement equals duplicates, the result equals 1. But where did it read the result from? Well, it read it from a query. So now I have a query that dynamically checks my system for duplicates, but then it writes it into a table, right? With measurements and with duplicates. So hopefully this was clear as it was so small. But I love the idea of how you can actually produce a report by doing multiple little queries and even steps, and then just bringing things together to have your report as a final report of the two, let's say, comparison of the two tables, right? So the idea here is think of even just queries themselves. These two are a perfect example. Or steps within queries, think of them as variables, as just, okay, this is the result of this step and it's saved as the name. So I can reuse that anytime I want to, right? It's not like Excel, when you go 2 steps down, those are gone. They're still there. You can still reference them. You can still get from them, right? So that's the idea of using steps as variables. Okay, now the second one, this one will be very simple. Let me just create a dummy table. ID, we want the ID to go from 1 to, I guess we want it to go down to 1003. So we just want it to go slightly beyond 1000, right? And then let's add date. Let's go with today, and let's just do this. And then let's add value, so a number. Let's just go rand between 1000. Let's bring that down. Let's guess those as values, and let's say this is a simple Excel table, right? And let's call it the 1000 rule. Okay, so now I have this table. Let me just bring the chat back. Okay, so now we have this table, and now we want to work with it in Power Query, right? So what I do is I say data from table range, and now I got a query from that table. Now, before I start playing around with this query, let me just say close and load to. And I'll only create a connection, so I'm not going to load it anywhere. But now I'm going to do some things that shouldn't be good, right? Over here, when it says 1002, I'm just going to say Gašper. Right here, when the date is the 15th, I'm going to say Christian, right? Over here, where I have a number, I'm going to go 100. Right, so in a sense of data quality, all of these are an issue. These should be numbers. This is not. This should be a date. This is obviously not. These are numbers again. This is not. Right? So let me go back to my query. And you're going to see it did kind of the same thing it did before. Right? So it created two steps, the source and a change type. Now, what is one of the things that we love most about Power Query? Well, one of the things I love most about Power Query is this little thing. Right? This little thing can help you immensely. This can help you. Oh, you got errors. You got empty rows, right? Or at least empty values in that column. But if you look at this, you should find it funny because, oh, this one says these are whole numbers. But this doesn't say like there's any errors. These are dates, or actually they're date time. Let me change that to a date. It really doesn't matter. But even with that, it still says, look, you got 0 errors, right? And this one also says you got numbers, 0 errors. Now we know there should be errors, so I'm going to refresh. I'm going to say, think about it again, 0. Now let me do something else. Let me just say, okay, let me add a step where I just say, you know what, take your ID, but sort descending, right? I don't like it that it's sorted like this. And all of a sudden it says, oh my God, you've got an error. Now, someone who's used to using Power Query or Power BI, doesn't matter, Power Query would go like this. This step is okay. This step is okay. Oh, this is it. This is the step that created it all. Now I just need to figure it out. What is this step? Well, this step just says you sorted rows. All you did was you took the rows and you sorted them. Now, I don't know about you, but usually I would think sorting doesn't create mistakes, right? So let's see what happened. Well, what happened is, even what's the mistake? It says, well, there's this little piece of text. It says Gašper. There's no way we can convert that to a number. But why is that an error when I'm just sorting? I didn't tell you to convert. Well, and here is the problem. If I go back here, why does it say there are no errors? Well, it's saying that because right here at the bottom it also says, I'm only looking at the top 1000. And what did we do? Well, we artificially created all the errors just below the 1000 row. So now if I go to this little button and I change it, look, check the entire data set. Now all of a sudden I see that it was step 2. Step 2 actually created all the errors. That's where they were, right? And now I know where I need to fix, because this one didn't create the errors. This one is just where the errors became visible because I was sorting, descending. So all of those rows that were below 1000 just came up, right? So this is just a little demo of how you should always be aware of the 1000 rule, or you should always be aware that this one, even if it looks nice, right? Even if it says, oh, look, there's no errors, nothing is empty, should always go, is that true for the entire data set? And you do that by clicking down here and just say, check the entire data set. Okay. Okay. So let me remove this one. And now we go for the third and final thing everyone should know about Power Query. Now, this one is very specific. I'm going to start the way I probably shouldn't start. I'm going to start with a definition, right? So let me go to my PowerPoint and let me give you a definition of query folding. So a query folding in Power Query refers to the process where steps defined in Power Query are translated and pushed back to the data source server rather than loading data into Power Query and then processing it. Not all data sources support query folding, and even for those that do, not all operations will result in query folding. Now that's a whole lot of word jungle there. But let me explain what this actually does, because it's one of the most brilliant things ever. Now, you probably know one of the first things you hear when you say, I'm going to start using Power Pivot, Power Query, is people tell you, oh, you should use 64-bit Excel or Power BI desktop, doesn't matter. And you should have at least 16 gigs of RAM on your computer. Now, why do people say that? Well, they say that because Power Query and Power Pivot runs in RAM. If you have 32-bit Excel, your RAM is limited to 2 gigs. Even if you have 64 gigs on the machine, the Excel can only use 2. So that's just a non-starter. It's just going to fail all the time, right? But for a better version, which is a 64, at least better in a sense of how much RAM it can use as much as the computer has, right? So that's why you use 64-bit. Well, and why is that important with Power Query? Well, it's extremely important because Power Query needs to run all the steps in memory, right? It needs to load all the data and run all the steps. But you have sources that are extremely big. And that can be your databases, your data warehouses, anything that you have in a relational database. Those are usually big tables, right? Now imagine bringing those tables into your memory. It's not going to end well. That's why Power Query has something called query folding. What it means is I'll take all the steps that you did, right? You pointed me to a SQL server, to a table, and then you said what you want done with it. What I'll do is I'll take these steps and I'll translate them to Transact SQL. And then I'll run that on the server. That's a big, big point. I'm not going to run it locally in memory. I'm going to run it on the server. And what you will receive is just the final result of that query. So I'm not going to download the whole table and then run steps locally. I'll do query folding. I'm going to run it where it should be run on the server and then just return the result that you need, right? But now let's check Okay, so here is where I try to emphasize the key part, right? So query folding refers to the process where steps defined in Power Query are translated into Transact SQL and pushed back to the server. So they're not run locally, they run on the server, right? And now let's check that in action. And this will be as simple as a check gets. So what I want you to do is this. I just want you to look at two results that I already have loaded. So here I have, let me just wait. Okay, here I have query folding 1 dummy data, and here I have query folding 2 dummy data. They come from these two queries. And I want you to notice the result is the same. They're literally the same thing. Or the resulting table is the same. Now let me show you the difference. I'm going to start with the second one because it's going to go like this. So let me show you. Right click, refresh, and it's done. Right, so it just went to the server and now it's done. Now let me show you this one. Right, again, it's going to return the same table. Right click, refresh. And now you should see something that as an Excel user, I would be extremely worried. Oh my God, 1 million, I can't even load that. My Excel has literally 1,048,000 rows. It's going to 2 million and it's going to go all the way to 2.5 million, right? If I'm just looking at this, I'm extremely worried as an Excel user, but when it gets to 2.5 million, something funny happens. It starts again. It starts again, and now it's going to go up to 19,000 and just load, right? So the end result is going to be the same. Now, you probably also notice this query took way longer to load, right? So what's happening here? Well, what's happening is this. Let me show you the first query. So the first query is very simple. It only has 3 steps. So source, navigation, and a simple filter. A filter to get just a single month of data, right? Because sometimes from the server, you don't need the entire fact table. You don't need all the columns. You don't need all the rows, right? So you remove those just to have the table that you need. And what this does is right click, view native query, which is your main sort of command to have in mind when you're doing this. View native query actually shows me, look, when I'm running this against the server, I'm just doing a simple select statement with a where clause, and the where clause is simply a filter, right? So where the date is greater than this and less than this. So it's returning everything within that month. And it's running this query on the server, so I don't see the 2.5 million rows that are on the server. All I see is the result. That's what gets returned, right? Now let me show you the other one. Now the other one has one simple step in between. It's literally these 3 steps, which are the same, and then there's a step in between which just says keep last rows. So basically all this does is it drops the first row. It just removes the first row, right? Now let me show you down here, right click. Oh, do you see how view native query is grayed out? Do you know why? Well, because what I did is something you should never do. I broke the fold. So query folding is a process where all of your steps get translated into Transact SQL, but sometimes you do a step that cannot be translated, and that is called You broke the fold. You broke the query folding part. So from this point onwards, and this is the important part, and let me tell you which step broke it. The keep last row step broke it. Simply because SQL has the top function, but it doesn't have the bottom function, right? So it can give you top 1 million rows, but it cannot give you bottom. And since there's no equivalent in Transact SQL, this step cannot be translated into Transact SQL. And if I show you a step before, right-click, View Native Query was here. It was still working. It did this. But then there's a step here that cannot be translated. And if I right-click, this is where the View Native Query disappeared. But what does that mean? Well, what that means is Power Query needs to do all of these steps. Well, it's just the two locally. So to do these last two steps, it needs to fetch 2.5 million rows of data, store them locally, run the two steps, and then return the 19,000. Right? Why? Well, because we broke the fold. So we created a step that doesn't fold. Another step that you could have done that does almost the same thing is change type. Funny enough, will sometimes get you. Add in the index column will always get you. So there are certain steps that you need to avoid. And here's how you think about it. You think about it in a sense of, okay, so if this step breaks the fold and I need to do it, let me just do this step before. So let me do all of the heavy lifting before, and then let it do this. I don't care, right? So in a sense, you say, do the filter before. Give me the small table. So do all of that on the server, bring me the small table, and then let me do those steps that are gonna obviously need to run locally, but give me the small table. Over here, it was the other way around. It needed to fetch 2.5 million of rows so that it could do the last two steps. And that's why this was such a big deal, right? So what is query folding? Again, query folding is where your steps get translated into T-SQL. So Transact SQL is just a language that SQL uses and gets run on the server. And that is key. And gets run on the server so that your computer or later on Power BI service doesn't do the heavy lifting. SQL Server was made to do this, whereas, of course, my computer and my Power Query engine was not really made to handle, giant databases. Of course, I can call them, but I need all the heavy lifting to go to the server, right? I just want the result. And as you saw here, the result went like this. The one that did the heavy lifting, that was. Okay, so a quick recap. Every time you want to see if this is happening, right now you're limited to this. Right now you're limited to going right-click to the step and see if you see the View Native Query. Oh, that didn't work. Let me go back. So right-click and see if you can see this one, View Native Query. This one, if you can see it, it means that your query is folding and will get run against the server, right? So it will show you, if you click it, it's going to show you the code that gets run. This is just a select from as simple as it gets, right? But as soon as you right click and you don't see it, that's when you broke the fold. That's when you broke the fold. And that's where you'll also see Power Query becomes very slow. Why? Well, because it needs to load everything in memory. Even though it's showing you the top 1000, it still needs to calculate in memory what the top 1000 is. So you need to be very, very careful about this. And let me just go back to the slides because I think I have two more. So this is not all, but these are just some of the sources that support query folding. Obviously, even Microsoft Access supports it, but all of your database engines would, right? So these are the sources that support query folding, and therefore, every time you connect to such a source, you should be careful, right? If you're doing it right, so that the query doesn't, so that you don't break the fold or you don't break query folding. Oh, and then there should be another one there. So what you should be careful is this: not all sources are the same and behave the same. But there are certain things that will always get you. Like if you add the index column, that one will always get you. If you do a bottom 1000, it's almost always going to get you. So what you should search for is your source and sort of the steps that are supported or non-supported. And I guess the best search would just be breaking the fold or query folding on your particular system and just see what works and what doesn't. But now you at least know exactly what it is, and now you have a perfect way of checking if your query folds or not, right? Okay, and with that, I'm going to open it to Q&A. Now, I don't know if my headphone is all there, but I didn't hear anything in between. So.
No, we were quiet.
Oh, okay. So there were no questions?
Not loud questions.
Okay, so let's go for the quiet questions then. I'm guessing the one in chat.
Yeah, Claire had one question at the end. Do you write the SQL directly, or is it handled by Power Query? And I think you can show it again there, and possibly mentioning data flows and folding indicators.
Yeah, we can do both. We can do both. So first, over here, Power Query writes the query, right? Or the SQL query. The Transact SQL is written by Power Query. You can write your own, and it does support query folding. If you write the query in this initial step, right? When you go to the SQL server, you will have, let me just wait for this one. You will have the option to write your own SQL, and that does support query folding. Not all of them do, but SQL Server does. Some others also do. So both would work, right? But in what I was showing, this right-click and view native query, this is SQL written by Power Query, basically, right? And then let me make Christian's dream come true. So if I go into my Power BI, let me just go like this.
I was mentioning this because it's coming to Power BI.
Yeah, so what I'm about to show you is kind of the future, right? But it's, well, I almost got it in Power BI at the summit, not yet. So you can, some of you can see it in Power BI as a preview feature, but you can definitely see it in data flows. Now, data flows is just Power Query online. It's not yet in Excel, but what I'm about to show you is just what Power Query will look like going forward, right? And what it will look like is this. Let me just find a good one. So I'm guessing I should have one in the demo workspace. So here's the demo workspace, and here's my data flow. Let me see. Da-da-dum. Okay, and the key here, let me just wait for it. Oh, that's a bad example, but okay. Yeah. Over here on the right, do you see these indicators? Now, unfortunately, there's no quick one, but usually you will have a green indicator with a lightning next to it, right? And what that means is up to that point, you're good. It's folding and your query is fast. As soon as you see this one, oh, now I got a problem. Now I did something to make the query slow, right? So these indicators are coming as a standard experience in Power Query. So you're going to see your steps, and then next to them, you're going to see these indicators. Not yet in Excel. Obviously, in data flows, they're already there. And if you have the preview features turned on, and if you have the preview version of Power BI Desktop, then you will also see them in there. And I see that someone pasted in the chat.
Yeah, Pavel already pasted a green screen.
Yeah, so you can look at that one and you'll see the green lightning.
Yeah, there is another question from Leo. What's the recommended way to use query results /measure/outputs in Power BI? Not sure I understand completely the question, Leo. You might want to come on mute and ask it and clarify it.
No, where is that?
It has
Go
a
ahead.
plus.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you, Gašper, for explaining so far. I hope that my question is not bothering. The background of it is that we want to use certain aspects of Power BI as our outcome. That's that's our use case, to use some functionalities to provide our customer with.
Okay.
But we actually don't want to use Power BI to manipulate the data, because that's not where our expertise lies, not in DAX, not in M. And actually, our data sets are so small that there's no need to bigger, I don't know, like SQL servers and so on and so forth. Excel is the way to go, and that's where we have expertise in within our colleagues in pivoting and using Excel. So now, what would be the recommended way to use what we can do with Power Query or Power Pivot to use those results that we create there in Power BI? As I saw that that Power Query uses how to explain, like same query language, so to speak, or that we can actually copy and paste the measure queries into Power BI to use them there. You know what I'm speaking of? But we were wondering if that's the best way to have our results in Power BI, or what would be better?
Let me play devil's advocate here just for a moment, or actually let me just make sure I got this right. So you want to use Power BI to serve your data to your clients, or actually to serve reports to your clients?
Right, dashboards, reports, right.
Okay. And you want to utilize, I guess, row level security and stuff like that Power BI gives you.
True.
Okay. But your data is in Excel, and you want to make this story as cohesive as you can and as good as it gets. So obviously, if you're using Power BI, you have Office 365. And if you have Office 365 and you want to use Excel as a data source for Power BI, your best way to go is that that Excel file needs to be on SharePoint. Now that can mean you create a SharePoint library for it. That could also mean you've got it in Teams. If it's in Teams, it's on SharePoint. It could also mean you have it in OneDrive for business. If you have it there, it also means it's on SharePoint. But it needs to be on SharePoint. And the reason is, if you have it on SharePoint, Power BI can talk to it, and you don't need any gateways, you don't need anything, right? And so Power BI can refresh anytime you want, and when you upload new data to that Excel, Power BI will just run with it. I didn't quite get the question on copying Power Query. Because if you already have Power Queries in Excel that create what you want, or have tables in Excel that are what you want, then all you need to do is just make those tables visible to Power BI, right? Now, as far as measures go, if you have measures in Power Pivot in Excel, yeah, those you can copy to Power BI. The languages are basically 99% the same. There are such minute differences like the all function and really minute differences between the two. Most of the stuff you can just copy across. Obviously, Power BI has functions that Power Pivot doesn't. But if you copy from Power Pivot to Power BI, everything should work.
And there is the non-icon option in Power BI that you can import a file directly. If you already have the Power Query and the Power Pivot model in Excel, you can just import everything if this is what you need.
Yeah, that's also true, but then you don't have the Excel anymore. I mean, you have
Exactly.
it, but you've imported everything into Power BI. So what Christian is talking about is import Power Query, Power Pivot, Power View. Well, you can forget about Power View, but Power Query and Power Pivot. Right,
No,
so you go to Power BI and you import.
I'm aware of this. I'm aware of what Christian just said. We then struggle a lot to manipulate this imported Excel files in Power BI. And while we were doing that, trying to figure out how things work, we found that for our use case, Power Query and Power Pivoting is much easier for us to use. I was aware of that. I could easily import an Excel file into Power BI, but then in going on to manipulate the data to receive the reports and dashboards and all that stuff that we want to provide the customer with, we're struggling a lot with that, and that's where not our expertise lies within our colleagues. And as Excel and those tools were actually the best way to go for our small data sets, we were
that's how I understood it. And if you want to do it in Excel,
right. So thank you very much, then.
Yeah.
There are at least two more questions. One from Christy Prifty in the chat. What tips and tricks would you recommend for learning about query folding and alternatives that can fold a default steps that breaks the fold?
You mean tips and tricks or sources?
Yeah, for learning about query folding and alternatives that.
Well, obviously trying and failing. Googling is always a thing. Basically, if you just take the two things that I showed you, so you take the right click, right? You can clearly see if it folds, up to where it folds, what is the code it produces, and where it breaks the fold. And that sort of gives you like the perfect execution point to then start researching, right? So that is basically one. And the other one is the query I showed you. Whenever you see this, what this one did, whenever you see a query that does this, that starts refreshing and then goes, well, now it's just to it. Oh, because I changed it. Sorry. Because I changed the sort order. It's doing this before. So let me change that again, like this. Let me go close and load. So every time you see a table do this or a query do this, where it's going to start loading, well, it's saying it's loading, but it will actually start and the number is going to go high, way higher than it should. And then all of a sudden it will reset and then it's going to become smaller. That's like the first thing to notice, to say, oh, okay, it just downloaded everything because it needed to do some more stuff locally, right? So that's how you notice it. Then you go search for it, you figure out where it breaks. And then the first question should be, okay, everything that is below this, Can we do that stuff before? Because if we can do all of that before, then we lose nothing. Even if we break the fold in the last step, doesn't matter. Well, obviously it's not nice, but it doesn't matter. Whereas if I can't, then I start searching online for, but the keywords are query folding, right? And breaking the fold. Those are the keywords to search by. Okay, somebody says Copilot. Not sure Copilot is going to be your best friend in these situations, but you can definitely try.
Yeah, and Pavel had his hand raised. Go, Pavel.
Yeah, thanks for me to talk. Well, I have two notes. First, what was just shown with this number of rows skyrocketing to unbelievable numbers. It's similar sign, warning red lights and sirens when you see megabytes loaded in Power Query, and you know that your file is I don't know 5 megabytes and it's loading like 250 megabytes already. Then it's not a query folding, but also in Power Query stuff that you are repeatedly reloading the same file. And by the way, there the Copilot is not your best friend, because typically it recommends you some way that it's just, yeah, you've got your results for small files, no problem, for small rows, no problem. But as soon as you start to go beyond few tens of thousands rows, you are in very deep hell. That was one note, but generally track and study this information window during the Power Query refresh. It is the first sign that something went very ugly and very wrong. The second point is discussion Excel versus database and loading Excel files and so on. Even if you have small Excel files that can be relatively quickly loaded into the Power BI model, and Power BI is then just doing the visualization. Imagine that you need to sustain this solution. And from time to time, someone would like to open this Excel and accidentally drop a character somewhere. Then your report is not going to work because you just corrupted the data types. Also, if typically the BI solution has an effect of snowball rolling down the hill. So at the start, yes, it would be just a report of 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, at whatever you like to there. But then someone start to yell, but we would like to compare it with previous year, months, day, whatever. And you then started to load several Excel files in one row to do the comparison there. And if you don't know the Power Query, this loading is going to be slower and much slower than doing the same stuff on database. And most importantly, on database, you are sure that the data type is okay, that no one is going to tinker with your input files, and that stability of your solution, whatever it is going to be much, much better than Excel-based stuff. I highly recommend to use, if you have an option, use database instead of Excels. Much faster, much more reliable, and definitely much more stable. Doesn't matter if you place the Excels on SharePoint lists, especially Excel on SharePoint or on SharePoint, sorry, not SharePoint list. They are very slow if you have more files in a SharePoint. And you know the SharePoints are going to be bloated with files. And then your report is going to take like 30 minutes in web service, and your administrator is not going to thank you much. So golden rule, if you can, push your data source to database. Excel is not database.
True. Thank you. Yeah, we have a really interesting challenge pasted in the chat, the 30-day folding challenge from Alex Powers. I also took it, and it helps if anyone wants to try which are the steps that folds and which are the ones that don't fold. And there is no additional question in the chat. whoever has a question, now is the time for the last one. And I don't see any hand raised. So thank you very much, Gašper. It was
my pleasure.
Great session. And I didn't want to say it at the beginning, but I told you so. A lot of people will be interested, and we had more than 50 people live. Thank you all for joining.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
And,
hopefully you found value in the session.
Yeah, there were some really surprised faces on all kind of steps that you've done. It was brilliant.
Okay.
I see that Nikos has a question. Go, Nikos. No, not anymore. Nikos, go on mute.
He said in the chat it's the wrong button.
Okay.
Oh, okay. No problem. Well, thanks again, Gašper. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Live. And see you on our next meetup or at SQL Bits starting tomorrow. I will stop the recording now, and whoever wants to stay for chit chat a bit more, no problem.